Welcome to the Louder Than Silence podcast with your host, CG Wagner. This month's episode is all about PTSD. My office at the last restaurant I ran was used by the former tenant as a closet. There was space for one chair and a desk in that space. When I had to have meetings, the other person would have to stand or to sit on a milk crate. There was not enough space for other options. There was no way to have a three-person meeting in this space. That had to be done either before business hours or in the back hallway leading outside. Calling the office cozy would be a gross exaggeration. There's nothing quite like being stuck in a small windowless room for hours on end each day. It wasn't exactly conducive to stable mental health. And on top of that, I was managing a team of 25 to 30 people. So I had to regularly have interactions with others in this overwhelmingly tiny space. But I made it work. A few months after we opened, it became clear that I was going to have to let one of the servers go. This person was consistently late, putting pressure on their coworkers to do all the work, setting up and preparing for the day without their help. It was becoming more and more of an issue, and I made it clear to them that they had to start arriving on time for their shift. Well, the tardiness continued, and it got to the point with them that I had to let them know that if they arrived late for their next shift, I was going to have to let them go. I explicitly told them that I was giving them this warning so that they wouldn't lose their job. And sure enough, for the next shift that they were scheduled, they arrived late. And now I had to terminate their employment in a closet masquerading as an office. I asked them to join me in the office and proceeded with the termination process. It did not go well. They became very angry with me, yelling at me, and berating me for how unfair I was being. Now, it's safe to say that it's difficult for most people to interface with someone who is visibly angry and verbally abusive. Now, put that interaction into a space where I'm within reach of an extremely angry person with no way to create additional space for myself, and they are directly between me and the door. They eventually stopped fighting and left, leaving a completely triggered me in the wake of things. I was shaking uncontrollably, could barely breathe, and was speechless. Mentally, I was fully in the place where I was under attack again and wasn't sure how I was going to survive. I don't remember anything else about that day. From the moment they walked out the door, my memory is a complete blank, despite the vivid details I remember from our several-minute interaction. All I can recall is a vague sense of struggling for several days afterward. And even as I put together my notes for this podcast, I found my palms sweating and a slight feeling of disorientation, even over a decade later. I've had numerous nightmares and flashbacks about this incident. I had to change my approach on giving negative feedback and having to terminate someone's employment in order to feel safe. Even as I've gotten to a healthier place, this situation has come to mind too many times to count. Unfortunately, there are several other instances of this magnitude beyond the sexual violence I experienced. At previous points in time, I felt like something was wrong with me, that I should be able to handle everything that life threw at me. Fortunately, now I see things differently. This is the second episode in our Survivors Have Paid Enough series. Each month, we're discussing the impacts of surviving sexual violence on 8 different areas of health and sharing survivor stories. Today, we are diving into the mental health impacts of surviving sexual violence, specifically PTSD. What we'll be exploring today is what PTSD is, how a survivor of sexual violence gets PTSD, what it looks like in day-to-day life, and what it looks like to address it. Now, I am not a therapist, psychologist, or a psychiatrist. This is all information that I have come to understand as a layperson. Remember, everything we do at Louder Than Silence is peer supported. So our discussion today is as a peer when it comes to mental health care training. But I am also having this discussion as an expert in what it means to survive sexual violence, since I have been healing from these traumas for over 2 decades now. As always, at LTS, we strongly advocate for survivors of sexual violence and other traumas to seek professional mental health care. Ready to jump in? Okay, great. I would guess that most people listening to this have heard of PTSD before, generally in the context of veterans. Sadly, in some settings, it has become so common that it is used conversationally as a throwaway. I have feelings about hearing people say that they have PTSD from their coffee order being incorrect or a person not messaging them back. Hopefully, this episode today helps explain the gravity of what we're talking about. And if I'm being honest, I hadn't really taken the time to sit with the concept of what PTSD is or what it stands for until recently. I'm guessing the same is true of most of you listening. As you may or may not know, PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. So let's take a minute to break that down. What does post-traumatic mean? Well, post simply means after. But what does traumatic mean? The way we define trauma in LTS discussions is the inability to maintain a sense of well-being and safety when facing pronounced or prolonged dangerous or harmful experiences. As an easy but not perfectly fitting metaphor, let's look at car accidents. A person can get into one catastrophic car accident that totals their car. Or a person can get into a fender bender. But before they have a chance to fix the damage, they get into another fender bender. The car is still drivable, but it's not quite as smooth as it once was. Let's say they get into two more minor accidents before they have a chance to fix the car. At this point, the car may very well be totaled, even though there were no major accidents. For humans, they can have PTSD after one single incident or after a series of incidences. Really, what the brain and body are saying is that they've reached a breaking point in what they can handle. It's when a dangerous or harmful event pushes them beyond what they can cope with in that moment. That's when it becomes trauma. And there's also often this description between a big T trauma versus a little t trauma. Big T trauma is the equivalent of that one major accident that totals the car. Little t traumas are the ones that can add up if they go unaddressed. One of the factors at play in PTSD is closing out the trauma loop, sometimes called the stress loop. And if you've ever seen a dog get stressed out and then shake, that's closing the stress loop. But if a person doesn't have the ability to close the loop, then the trauma stays within the nervous system. Crying, screaming, running, and shaking are some examples of what it looks like for a human to close the stress loop in the moment. And this also explains how two people can be in the same dangerous situation, but have two very different outcomes. If a person has had fewer dangerous events to process through and clear out, or they have been able to clear the stress from the body, they are less likely to experience the next dangerous situation as traumatic. Another description for trauma is often called fight or flight mode. We now know it's actually 4 different potential responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which is another episode in and of itself. Regardless, our bodies and brains go into this mode when something signals that our life is being threatened. So this means that our brains and body recognize the experience as a near-death experience. And I don't think it would surprise most people to hear that something that our brains and bodies consider to be a near-death experience would also be registered as traumatic. And once the experience is beyond what the person can tolerate, that's when they get PTSD, which means the brain signals that the danger is still happening in real time. Even after significant time has passed, the brain and body can believe that they are presently experiencing the near death experience. So, as a quick recap, trauma is when our bodies and brains cannot cope with the level of danger or harm. And it can be a series of little t traumas or a big T trauma. PTSD is often what happens after these events push our bodies and brains outside of what they can manage. All right, so we've got the post-traumatic part covered. What about the stress disorder? The shortest way I can think to explain this idea is that it means the body and brain struggle to navigate additional challenges to the nervous system, whether or not they are actually dangerous or harmful. For the sake of an easy explanation, let's say a person starts each day with 100 stress units. And each time something stressful happens, they use a certain number of those units. Someone cutting them off in traffic might be 2 units, while an argument with a partner might be 25 units. Regardless, as the day goes on, the person spends these units on day in and day out life. But for a person who has experienced traumas like I just talked about, they may only start the day with 20 units now. So one argument with a partner may use more stress units than what they have access to. Since there's no tolerance for additional inputs, the brain and body kick into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode because there's no way to cope. This is when people will sometimes refer to someone as having snapped. All of a sudden, there's simply nothing left that keeps them grounded in the present moment. The brain and body have gone into survival mode. And this is where the reactivity comes in, even outside of these times. Because there are precious few stress units available, the person always has to be on high alert for potential dangers. In short, after trauma, a person is constantly assessing threats of danger or harm while trying to manage life with a limited ability to deal with additional stressful inputs. Now, last episode, I also mentioned something called CPTSD or complex PTSD. This is not an official diagnosis in the DSM, which is the mental healthcare industry guidance on official diagnostic codes. However, it is something that is often referred to when dealing with ongoing traumatic events. CPTSD is a result of big T traumas happening repeatedly and or over a long period of time. It is common to see when a person It is common to see this when a person experiencing trauma doesn't have a way out of the situation and the brain is trying to cope with being in a near-death situation with no reprieve or end in sight. While generally associated with childhood traumas, CPTSD can also happen in adults. CPTSD manifests in most of the same ways that PTSD does, with additional components around an impact on self-image, the ability to function in relationships, and a combination of hypervigilance and avoidance. It's an expression of the multiple layers of trauma that have overlapped in the person's life. Okay, so now we have a better understanding of PTSD. Let's chat about how a survivor of sexual violence may end up with PTSD or CPTSD. The National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder found in 2005 that 94%, I'm going to say that again, 94% of women experience PTSD symptoms during the first 2 weeks after a sexual assault. I mentioned the concept earlier of how the brain and body respond to near-death situations. Well, this clearly shows that sexual violence is definitely considered to be a near-death experience. Quite simply, if a person is willing to harm someone so significantly as to perpetrate sexual violence, they have already demonstrated a massive disregard for human life. It is little wonder that trauma responses and survival mode automatically kick in during the attack. And in another study, changes in cognitive mediators of rape's impact on psychological health across 2 years of recovery, which is a big long title. Individuals who receive bad or no support report more PTSD symptoms. So, without a strong support system, those 94% of people that we talked about from the last study are more likely to still be experiencing PTSD symptoms years down the line. We know that around 80% of sexual violence is perpetrated by people who know the victim. This means that if a victim reports, it is very likely that the person they know, that the person they tell, knows or has a connection with the perpetrator in some fashion. So, how many victims are truly, wholeheartedly believed and supported if the person they told has some level of relationship with the perpetrator? And on top of that, this also means that the perpetrator is likely a member of the victim's family, friend circle, faith group, student body, community, etc. This is often one of the reasons victims cite for not disclosing the violence initially. There are too many people in their lives who know the perpetrator. In many cases, myself included, there is fear that the perpetrator will find out about a disclosure and potentially cause even more harm. This all leaves victims in a place of feeling isolated, and as the study shows, if a survivor receives bad or no support, they have more PTSD symptoms. So, surviving sexual violence leads to high rates of PTSD symptoms, and those symptoms are prolonged with more exposure to trauma, danger, and harmful events. Without safe community and support, those symptoms are likely to linger for years. So, what do these symptoms look like? As I like to explain, a person may end up with PTSD after a car accident. It may be difficult for them to drive for a while or even be a passenger in a car. They may avoid being in certain types of vehicles. They may avoid certain roads. This all makes sense. But unlike sexual violence, they don't have to worry if the car is going to show up where they work. They don't have to wonder if the car knows where they live. There's no concern if the car has access to bank account, email, or other sensitive information. The car will never show up in their bedroom one night. The car won't leave threatening voicemails or send alarming texts. There aren't people in their lives who know the car or will defend the car's behavior. And these are just some of the things that survivors experiencing PTSD experience. Just as being in a car accident means potentially driving different routes or altering the way a person interacts with the world altogether, so a survivor of sexual violence has to consider all the ways they may interface with danger. Then beyond that, there are the nightmares, the daymares, the flashbacks, and the intrusive thoughts that all hit without warning. And the survivor becomes disconnected from their own bodies. Their heart rate, breathing, and sweating change with the drop of a hat, the slightest activation. They can't feel themselves anymore. This often manifests in digestive issues, rashes or breakouts, and headaches or migraines. Anxiety, depression, or a combination are also very common. Life simply feels unmanageable, no matter how hard they try. And this often leads to thoughts of self-harm. So coping mechanisms kick in, leading people to automatic responses to manage the struggle. Alcohol and drug use, risky sexual behaviors, aggression, eating disorders, uncontrolled electronics use like gaming, scrolling, or binge watching, spiritual or intellectual bypassing, and many other strategies are used in order to avoid feeling the effects of the devastation. While experiencing PTSD, quite simply, the entire person's being, mind, body, and soul, is trying to figure out how to manage after feeling like they were on the brink of death. It is constantly assessing threats and one's safety. It is being sure that something bad will happen again. And that leads to a feeling of hopelessness that things will never improve. It is all of that, and yet it is also so much more. One of the challenges I face in my role at LTS is trying to help others understand just how incredibly damaging sexual violence is and the sheer amount of time, energy, effort, and money it takes to heal. When I say that sexual violence impacts every area of a survivor's life, what I mean is every single area. And most of that manifests or originates in PTSD. But as always, there is hope, though. There are ways to work through PTSD. My first recommendation is to read or listen to The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. He does an excellent job of describing what happens post-trauma and what can be done to address it. This book literally changed my life. It is what convinced me to try EMDR for myself. That led to the idea for Louder Than Silence. And that eventually led to you listening to this podcast today. So, since it's already indirectly impacted your life, you might as well read it, right? Now, beyond reading the book, I often talk about the 3 ways for survivors to work on their healing. So for step 1, it's develop healthy relationships with a handful of people who are safe, have good boundaries, and you can rely on as you work through your healing. As we talked about earlier, without good responses from those in our lives, we end up cycling through the PTSD symptoms longer. You can't heal in a vacuum. You need to have surrounded yourself with people who find your healing valuable and that you are worth investing in. Now, step 2 is to find trauma-specific mental health care. I highly recommend EMDR, which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing. It is a big fancy name. But what you need to know is that it is a therapy specifically designed to help reduce and eliminate PTSD symptoms. There have been numerous studies that show between a 90 and 99% effectiveness rate in alleviation of PTSD symptoms. Think about that. There's someone listening to this right now who might have 99% of their PTSD symptoms go away once they go through EMDR. Incredible. One thing to mention, though, is that trauma-specific therapy is crucial. The analogy I use is imagine your house is on fire. You can get out your garden hose and spray the fire. It will help, but it won't put out the fire. Consider then calling a firefighter and having them use the fire hose on the fire. That will actually put it out. This is the difference between something being trauma-informed versus being trauma-specific. Find a mental health care provider who addresses PTSD and CPTSD. It makes a huge difference. It will help put out the fire. Now, the third step is to get curious. Once you have the community support you need and are getting trauma-specific mental health care, the world's your oyster when it comes to ways to undo the trauma beyond that. I'm going to list some of the ways that trauma can be addressed here, but these are all ways to complete the trauma and stress loop, allowing the brain to recognize that the past is past. I suspect that there's something on this list that will resonate with you. So you can do art therapy, dance therapy, music therapy, equine therapy, yoga therapy, sound therapy, screaming, writing, yoga, meditation, breath work, Rolfing or structural integration, massage, exercise, and coloring. Try it out. Anything that helps you reconnect with your heart, your body, your dreams, it's all good stuff. You are the expert on being you, and you are the expert on what you need to be the best version of yourself. There are no wrong answers here. You may try something that's not the right fit. Great. Now you understand yourself better. You may try something and absolutely love it, and it completely changes your life. Amazing. Good for you. But the key is reconnecting to yourself, listening to yourself, and find what brings the most healing. And it may not be anything that I mentioned on this list, but be curious and explore. You can have a life that is free or mostly free of PTSD symptoms, even if you've been living with them for decades. I have hope for all of us that we can reduce the impact that trauma has had on our lives and set ourselves up to keep walking down the path we want for ourselves. But as always, no one can do this work for us. Yes, someone else caused the damage. Yes, we can find support from our community, but no one can actually make the changes on our behalf. That's all us. When I think back to the story that I started with, the one about being cornered in my office, I can see now how I'm in a totally different space. I would be able to speak up for myself instead of allowing the abuse. I would have gotten out of the physical space that I was in instead of freezing. I would have been able to shake it off and go about my day instead of feeling off kilter for days at a time. And this is the hope I hold for all of you, friends. You have already paid enough, and there is hope that the past will not affect your future in the same ways anymore. I believe it, and I hope you can too. Thank you for listening to the Louder Than Silence podcast. If you'd like more information about our organization, visit us at louderthansilence.org and sign up for our newsletter or follow us on Instagram at louderthansilence.org. If you like our work, please consider donating today. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast for the most current episodes. See you next month.